Bill Gates once stood in front of an audience at a venture capital event and said something remarkable. He admitted that he had made the greatest mistake ever. He wasn't talking about a bad investment or a failed product launch. He was talking about losing control of the world's most important computing platform and handing it to a competitor on a silver platter. That mistake had nothing to do with Windows. It had everything to do with what came after Windows. And the consequences of that decision are still unfolding today. Millions of people are walking away from Windows because of a 34-year-old operating system built by volunteers that Gates once tried to bury, and the numbers showing this shift are real, measurable, and accelerating. In a 1999 internal memo that became public through court proceedings, Gates expressed concern that hardware partners were doing work that would benefit Linux, and he made clear that he viewed this as a problem. A decade later, his successor Steve Ballmer famously called Linux a cancer. And yet, the platform that handed Microsoft its most humiliating defeat was fundamentally a Linux-based system. Linux is an operating system kernel, the core layer of software that sits between the hardware of a computer and everything that runs on top of it. It was created in 1991 by a Finnish student named Linus Torvalds, who released it to the public for free. Over the following decades, thousands of developers around the world contributed to it, improving it, hardening it, and adapting it to run on everything from smartphones to supercomputers. Today, Linux powers 100% of the world's 500 fastest supercomputers. It runs on the servers that deliver the websites and apps you use every day. It powers Android, which runs on roughly 72% of the world's smartphones. It runs on the vast majority of cloud infrastructure, including the servers inside Microsoft's own Azure cloud platform. The world's most critical digital infrastructure runs on Linux, just not, historically, on the desktops that ordinary people use. That last part has been changing. And in 2025, it changed faster than at any point in the history of the operating system. For years, Linux on the desktop was treated as a curiosity, a hobbyist thing. The running joke in the tech community was that every year someone would declare it the year of the Linux desktop, and every year nothing much would change. That joke no longer lands the way it used to. According to data from StatCounter, which tracks global web traffic across billions of monthly page views, Linux desktop usage in the United States crossed 5% of the desktop operating system market for the first time in June 2025. The global figure reached approximately 4.7% around the same time. To put that in context, Linux desktop usage was at 2.76% globally in July 2022. That is a roughly 70% increase in 3 years. The acceleration is notable. It took Linux about 8 years to go from 1% to 2% market share. It took about 2 years to go from 2% to 3%. But going from 3% to 4% took less than a year. The rate of adoption has been quickening. The US government's own digital analytics program, which tracks visitor data across more than 5,000 federal websites, reported that 6% of users were running Linux as of August 2025. That is not a tech blog's estimate. That is the federal government's own traffic data. Among software developers, the Stack Overflow Developer Survey for 2025 found that nearly 28% of respondents use Ubuntu, the most popular Linux distribution, for personal use, and an almost identical percentage use it professionally. India leads all major economies in Linux desktop adoption, with a 16% share recorded in mid-2024, reflecting that country's large developer, community, cost-sensitive consumer base, and government initiatives around open-source software. Windows still dominates the global desktop market with around 70 to 72%. Nobody is claiming otherwise. But the direction of movement matters, and the direction is clearly away from Windows and toward alternatives, with Linux picking up a meaningful share of that drift. The most direct catalyst for the current surge in Linux adoption is something Microsoft set in motion years ago, and it arrived on October 14, 2025. That was the day Microsoft officially ended mainstream support for Windows 10. After that date, Windows 10 stopped receiving security patches and updates, unless users paid for Microsoft's extended security update program. For the average person running Windows 10 on a machine that cost them good money and still works perfectly well, this was a hard stop. The obvious path Microsoft wanted users to take was to upgrade to Windows 11, but Windows 11 has hardware requirements that a large portion of existing PCs cannot meet. It requires a hardware security feature called TPM 2.0 Secure Boot support and processors from relatively recent generations. Millions of machines that ran Windows 10 without issue were simply declared ineligible for Windows 11 by Microsoft's own upgrade tool. For those users, the choices were buy new hardware, pay for extended security coverage on an aging system, or find another way. Linux provides that other way, and it does so for free. Responding to this situation, a group within the Linux community launched a campaign they called End of 10, organized with the support of developers from the GNOME and KDE projects, two of the most prominent desktop environment teams in Linux. The campaign assembled migration resources, organized help events at repair cafes and community spaces, and created guides in multiple languages to help Windows users make the transition. It was a coordinated, practical response to a very specific moment in computing history. The concern about hardware waste adds another layer. Organizations involved in the End of 10 campaign pointed out that forcing users to replace still functional hardware creates significant amounts of electronic waste. Linux, which continues to support older hardware effectively, offers a path to extending the useful life of existing machines. Individual users switching operating systems is one thing, governments migrating entire institutional fleets is another, and in the past 2 years, the latter has been happening at a pace that would have seemed unlikely a decade ago. In April 2024, the German state of Schleswig-Holstein announced a full migration of over 30,000 government workers from Windows to Linux. This is described as one of the largest Linux migrations in European government history. The state is replacing Microsoft Office with LibreOffice, its file-sharing infrastructure with Nextcloud, and the Windows operating system, itself with a Linux distribution. The stated reasons include data sovereignty, the concern that sensitive government data was being processed by software running under conditions the state could not fully control. France's National Gendarmerie, the country's national police force, has been running a custom Ubuntu-based Linux distribution called Gendbuntu since 2008. As of recent reporting, over 103,000 computers in that organization run Linux. This migration has been in place for over 15 years. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs committed in 2025 to a transition away from Microsoft software toward open-source platforms, including Linux. The Danish digital minister explained the reasoning directly. She said the country must not make itself so dependent on so few suppliers that it can no longer act freely. Half of the ministry's staff had begun migrating by August 2025, with full implementation targeted for the autumn of that year. The Spanish regions of Andalusia and Valencia have their own Linux-based projects underway. Munich, Germany, which ran a famous Linux migration called Linux from 2004 to 2017 before reversing course, has re-established an open-source program office and is once again pursuing open-source alternatives. The overarching reason for this European shift is what's being called digital sovereignty, the ability of governments and institutions to control their own digital infrastructure without being dependent on companies headquartered in another country and subject to another country's laws. For a long time, the one area where Linux could not realistically compete with Windows was gaming. Windows had decades of hardware driver support and game compatibility that Linux simply could not match. That gap has been narrowing dramatically. Valve Corporation, the company behind the Steam gaming platform, has invested heavily in a compatibility layer called Proton, which allows many Windows games to run on Linux without modification by the developer. Through Proton, a large portion of the Steam library has become playable on Linux. Valve also released the Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device running Steam OS, a Linux-based operating system. The Steam Deck introduced Linux to a new category of users who never thought of themselves as open-source advocates. They were gamers who wanted a handheld device, and the device they got happened to run Linux. Steam's own hardware and software survey reported that Linux gaming reached 3.05% of Steam users in October 2025, the highest level ever recorded since Steam launched Linux support. That figure represents a 52% increase compared to October 2024. These are not trivial numbers for a platform that has historically been almost entirely Windows-based. The gaming barrier to Linux is not gone. Games with certain types of anti-cheat software remain difficult or impossible to run on Linux, but the number of games that work well has grown substantially, and for many users, the library is now large enough to meet their needs. Bill Gates identified his greatest regret as losing the mobile platform to Android. Android is built on the Linux kernel. Microsoft fought Linux for years, with Gates internally strategizing about how to prevent it from benefiting from hardware standards, and Ballmer publicly calling it a cancer. And yet, the open source approach that Microsoft opposed produced Android, which became the dominant mobile platform. It produced the infrastructure that powers the internet. It produced the gaming platform that is now eating into Windows gaming exclusivity, and it is now producing the desktop operating system that governments and individuals are turning to as Windows licensing policies and hardware requirements push them toward the exit. The irony here is structural. Microsoft built its empire on software that only Microsoft controlled. It charged licensing fees, dictated hardware, requirements, collected data about how users use their machines, and updated the software on its own schedule according to its own priorities. That model worked for decades. But the world that model created, one where a vendor can end support for your machine, require you to buy new hardware to use their latest version, and store your data in data centers under another country's jurisdiction, is the world that is now driving people away. The alternative that people are moving toward Linux is everything that Microsoft was not. No single company controls it. No one can end of life it by corporate decision. No one can decide that your hardware is no longer eligible. No one can flip a switch and cut off access because of a political dispute. For many professional workflows, particularly in creative industries, legal and financial sectors, and enterprise environment, there is specialized software that simply does not run on Linux and has no fully equivalent replacement. The Adobe Creative Suite, for instance, has no native Linux version, and while workarounds exist, they are not seamless for professional use. Many enterprise resource planning systems, compliance tools, and legacy business applications are Windows dependent. The support model for Linux is also different from Windows. There is no central helpline. Help comes from documentation, online communities, and third-party service providers. For individuals and organizations without technical staff, this can be a real obstacle. Software installation on Linux, while much improved through modern package managers, remains more complex than simply downloading a file and clicking through a familiar installer. None of these challenges is insurmountable, and many of them are shrinking year over year. But they are real, and anyone considering a switch should go in with eyes open. Bill Gates described mobile as a winner-take-all market. He was right, and he described his failure to win it as his greatest mistake. He was right about that too. What he did not say is that the desktop market may be approaching its own inflection point. Not the same kind of overnight winner-take-all dynamic, but a sustained, multi-front erosion that is being driven by governments seeking independence, individual users who cannot afford new hardware, developers who have always preferred Linux, gamers who followed Valve into a new ecosystem, and privacy-conscious people who no longer want their data on someone else's servers under someone else's laws. The data points in one direction. Linux desktop usage more than doubled between 2022 and 2025. The US crossed 5%. India is already at 16%. European governments are running migrations that will take tens of thousands of desktops off Windows permanently. The Linux gaming library grows every month. The hardware barrier, the single biggest structural advantage Windows has maintained, is what end-of-life policies are actively helping Linux overcome by pushing users to reconsider their options. Gates said there is room for exactly one non-Apple operating system. On mobile, he lost that slot. On the desktop, the question is no longer whether Linux will grow. The question is how far and how fast. The answer, right now, appears to be further and faster than anyone outside the open source community has been paying attention to.